The first thing I remember is the sound of the lock clicking shut, echoing off the cold concrete walls. I was standing at the top of the basement stairs, arms full of old photo albums, when the door slammed behind me. I spun around, confused, and heard the bolt slide into place. "Hello?" My voice bounced back at me, thin and uncertain. I set the albums down and tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on the door, calling out for my wife, for my daughter, for anyone. No answer. The only light came from a single bare bulb overhead, flickering as if it might go out at any moment. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mildew and old cardboard. I checked my pockets. No phone. I'd left it charging in the kitchen, never imagining I'd need it. My stomach rumbled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since breakfast. There was nothing in the basement but boxes, broken furniture, and a rusty old sink that hadn't worked in years. No food, no water, no bathroom. I tried to keep calm, telling myself it was a mistake, a prank gone too far. But as the hours dragged on, fear crept in. I shouted until my throat was raw, banged on the door until my knuckles bled. Still, no one came. The only sounds were the distant hum of the furnace and the occasional creak of footsteps above me. I listened, straining to make out voices, but all I heard was laughter. My wife's sharp, brittle laugh, my daughter's nervous giggle, the low murmur of my son-in-law, David. I realized with a sickening jolt that they were celebrating. Without me. I slumped to the floor, my back against the wall, and tried to piece together what had happened. The day had started like any other. Coffee in the kitchen, a quick trip to the store, a list of chores my wife had left on the counter. She'd been distant lately, snapping at me for small things, spending more time with our daughter and David. I'd tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just stress, just the strain of too many years and too many disappointments. But now, locked in the basement, I saw it for what it was, a plan. A betrayal. I lost track of time, the hours blurring together in the dim light. My mouth was dry, my head pounding. I tried to sleep, but the cold seeped into my bones, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. Smiling, laughing, free. I wondered if they'd ever let me out, or if I was meant to disappear, forgotten in the darkness. At some point I heard footsteps on the stairs. The door creaked open, and David's face appeared, pale and anxious. "Are you okay?" he whispered. I shook my head, too weak to speak. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him. "I'm sorry. I didn't know they'd do this. I thought it was just a joke, but they're serious. They want you gone." He helped me to my feet, his hands shaking. "We have to get out of here. I'll call the police." He led me up the stairs, his arm around my shoulders, and together we slipped out the back door into the cold night. The air was sharp, the stars bright overhead. I breathed in, feeling life return to my body. David pulled out his phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. "My father-in-law's been locked in the basement. No food, no phone, no bathroom. Please send help." As we waited for the sirens, I looked back at the house, my house, and felt a surge of anger, of resolve. This wasn't over. If you enjoy powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. I would make sure they paid for what they'd done. And this time, I would fight back with everything I had. The night air stung my face as David and I waited on the back porch. the silence between us heavy with shock and shame. I could barely stand, my legs trembling from hours spent on the cold basement floor, my mouth so dry I could hardly swallow. David hovered nearby, glancing nervously at the kitchen window, where the faint glow of laughter and clinking glasses drifted out into the darkness. I could hear my wife's voice, sharp and triumphant, as she toasted to new beginnings. My daughter's laughter followed, brittle and forced. I realized, with a sickening clarity, that they truly believed I was out of the way. Forgotten, discarded, a problem solved. David pressed his phone to his ear, whispering urgently to the 911 operator. Yes, he's here. He's weak, he hasn't eaten or had water all day. No, there's no bathroom in the basement. Please hurry. He looked at me, guilt etched deep in his eyes. I'm so sorry. I thought they were just angry, that they needed space. I never imagined they'd do this. I tried to speak, but my voice was a rasp. Thank you, David. You're the only one who cared. He shook his head, his hands shaking. I should have done something sooner. The minutes crawled by, each one stretching into eternity. I shivered, pulling David's jacket tighter around my shoulders, my mind racing with questions. How long had they planned this? What would have happened if David hadn't checked the basement? Would anyone have noticed if I'd simply disappeared? The sound of sirens cut through the night, growing louder as they approached. Red and blue lights flashed across the backyard, illuminating the fear on David's face and the determination in mine. 2 police officers hurried up the steps, their eyes widening as they took in my condition. "Sir, are you all right?" one asked, his voice gentle but urgent. I nodded, swallowing hard. They locked me in the basement. No fatale. Food, no phone, no bathroom. I was helpless. The officers exchanged a look, then turned to David. Who did this? David hesitated, glancing at the house. My wife. Her mother. They said he was in the way. The officers radioed for an ambulance, then led me to the front yard, where neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. I saw my wife and daughter at the window, their faces pale with shock as they realized what was happening. The paramedics checked my vitals, wrapped me in a blanket, and gave me water. I could feel the strength returning to my body, the anger burning brighter with every breath. One of the officers took my statement, his pen scratching across the notepad as I recounted every detail. The locked door, the hours in the dark, the laughter above me, the utter helplessness. We'll need to speak with your wife and daughter, he said, his tone grim. This is a serious crime, sir. You could have died down there. I nodded, my jaw set. I want to press charges. I want them to answer for what they did. David stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything. As the ambulance drove me to the hospital, I stared out the window at the house I'd called home for 30 years, now just a shell filled with betrayal. I made a silent promise to myself I would not let this break me. I would fight back, not with violence, but with the truth, with evidence, with the law, with the quiet, relentless power of a man who had nothing left to lose. The first battle was over. The war for my dignity, my freedom, and my future had just begun. The hospital lights were harsh and sterile, but I welcomed their brightness after the suffocating dark of the basement. Nurses moved around me with quiet efficiency, checking my blood pressure, drawing blood, and asking gentle questions about my ordeal. I answered as best I could, my voice still hoarse, my body aching from dehydration and cold. David never left my side, his face drawn with worry and guilt. When the doctor arrived, he shook his head in disbelief. Locked in a basement? No food, no water, no bathroom. You're lucky to be alive, sir. I managed a weak smile. Luck had nothing to do with it. My son-in-law saved me. David squeezed my hand, his eyes shining with relief. As I rested, I replayed every moment in the basement, every sound, every word I'd overheard. I remembered my wife's laughter, the clink of glasses, the way my daughter had called me a burden just days before. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound. A police officer arrived to take my formal statement. I described the events in detail, emphasizing the lack of food, water, and a bathroom, the locked door, the hours of isolation. David corroborated my story, explaining how he'd found me and called for help. The officer nodded, his face grim. We've already spoken to your wife and daughter. They claim it was an accident, that you must have locked yourself in by mistake. I felt a surge of anger. That's a lie. They planned this. They wanted me out of the way. The officer made careful notes. We'll investigate. In the meantime, you'll need to stay somewhere safe. Do you have family or friends you can stay with? I nodded, thinking of my old friend Tom, who had always said his guest room was open to me. As I was discharged, David offered to drive me. You can stay with us if you want. I know things are complicated, but you're family. I thanked him, but declined. You've done enough, David. Need some time to think. He nodded, understanding. If you need anything, call me. I'll testify. I'll do whatever it takes. As we drove through the city, I watched the lights blur past, my mind racing with plans. I knew I needed evidence, proof that this wasn't an accident, that my wife and daughter had conspired to lock me away. I remembered the security cameras I'd installed in the house years ago, the ones my wife had always complained about. If they hadn't disabled them, there might be footage of the whole thing. I called Tom, explaining everything. He was furious. You're staying with me, no arguments, and tomorrow we're going to your house to get those camera files. That night I lay in Tom's guest room, staring at the ceiling, the events of the past day replaying in my mind. I felt a strange mix of fear and determination. I was wounded, humiliated, but I was not broken. I would gather evidence. I would build my case. And when the time came, I would face my wife and daughter in court, not with anger, but with the quiet, relentless power of the truth. As I drifted off to sleep, I made a silent vow. I would never let anyone make me feel helpless again. The next morning, sunlight streamed through Tom's guest room window, and for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. Tom greeted me with strong coffee and a determined look. We're going to your house, and we're not leaving without those camera files. I nodded, my resolve hardening. We drove across town in silence, the city waking up around us, my mind replaying every moment of my captivity. When we arrived, Tom parked a block away, just in case. I watched my own house from a distance, noting the drawn curtains and the absence of my wife's car. She's probably out shopping or meeting friends, I muttered, bitterness creeping into my voice. Tom clapped me on the shoulder. Let's move. We slipped around the back, entering through the garage with the spare key I'd given Tom years ago. The house was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of last night's dinner and something sour. Resentment, maybe, or just the memory of betrayal. I made my way to the small office off the kitchen where the security system's hard drive was hidden behind a false panel in the wall. My hands shook as I entered the code, half expecting to find the drive missing, but it was still there, humming quietly. Tom stood guard at the door while I connected the drive to my laptop, my heart pounding as I scrolled through the footage. There it was, my wife and daughter, standing at the top of the basement stairs, whispering. My wife handed my daughter the key, her voice cold and clear. "He'll be fine. He needs to learn his place." My daughter nodded, her face hard. "He's always in the way. This is for the best." I watched as they closed the door, slid the bolt, and walked away, laughing. The footage showed them returning hours later, checking the lock, ignoring my muffled shouts. I felt a wave of nausea, but also a surge of vindication. This was the proof I needed. Tom watched over my shoulder, his face pale with anger. "You've got them, Richard. This is open and shut." I copied the files to a flash drive, then checked the rest of the footage for anything else, any sign of David, any hint that this was more than just a cruel prank. I found a clip of David pacing in the kitchen, arguing with my wife. "This isn't right. He's your husband. You can't just lock him away." My wife's voice was icy. "Stay out of it, David. This is family business." David shook his head, his voice trembling. "If you don't let him out, I will." I saved the clip, my respect for David growing. We left the house as quietly as we'd entered, locking the door behind us. Back at Tom's, I called the police detective assigned to my case. "I have video evidence. You need to see this." The detective arrived within the hour, and I showed him the footage, explaining every detail. He watched in silence, then nodded. "This is more than enough. We'll bring them in for questioning, and with your son-in-law's testimony, the case is solid." Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with sadness. My own wife and daughter had tried to erase me, to make me disappear, but now the truth was out, and the law was on my side. As the detective left, Tom poured us both a drink. "You did it, Richard. You turned the tables." I nodded, feeling the first real sense of power since the ordeal began. The next step was the courtroom, and I was ready. The days leading up to the court hearing were a blur of preparation, anxiety, and a strange, simmering anticipation. I spent hours with Tom and the detective, reviewing every second of the security footage, every text message, every voicemail. David came by after work, his face drawn but resolute. "I'll testify, Richard. I'll tell them exactly what I saw and what I heard. I can't believe they did this to you." I thanked him, feeling a surge of gratitude for his courage. The detective explained the process. My wife and daughter would be brought in for questioning, and the evidence would be presented to the district attorney. If the DA agreed, charges would be filed: unlawful imprisonment, elder abuse, conspiracy. The words sounded heavy, almost surreal, but I clung to them like a lifeline. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I lay awake in Tom's guest room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in the basement, every word of betrayal. I wondered if my wife and daughter felt any remorse, if they understood the gravity of what they'd done. I doubted it. The next morning, I dressed carefully in a suit and tie, determined to face them with dignity. Tom drove me to the courthouse, the city passing by in a blur of grey and gold. The courtroom was cold and formal, the air thick with tension. My wife and daughter sat at the defense table, their faces pale and defiant. My wife refused to meet my eyes, but my daughter glanced at me, her expression flickering between guilt and anger. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. The prosecutor laid out the case, presenting the security footage, the text messages, and David's testimony. The video played on a large screen, the sound of the lock sliding into place echoing through the silent room. My wife's voice was clear, her words chilling. "He needs to learn his place." My daughter's agreement was equally damning. The defense tried to argue that it was a misunderstanding, a family dispute blown out of proportion. But the evidence was overwhelming. David took the stand, his voice steady as he described what he'd seen and heard. I tried to stop them. I told them it was wrong. When they wouldn't listen, I called the police. The judge listened intently, her expression grave. When it was my turn, I described the ordeal in detail, the hunger, the thirst, the humiliation of having no phone, no food, no bathroom, the fear that I might never be found. I spoke of the betrayal, the pain, and the resolve that had carried me through. The courtroom was silent as I finished, the weight of my words hanging in the air. The prosecutor rested the case, and the judge called a recess. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, but I felt stronger than I had in weeks. Tom clapped me on the back. "You did it, Richard. You told your story. Now let the law do its work." As I waited for the verdict, I realized that no matter what happened, I had reclaimed my dignity. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor, and I was ready for whatever came next. The courthouse hallway was a world of its own, echoing with the shuffle of shoes and the low murmur of anxious voices. I sat on a hard wooden bench, Tom beside me, his presence a steady anchor as we waited for the judge to return. David paced nearby, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his jaw clenched with nerves. I watched the defense attorney whisper urgently to my wife and daughter, their faces tight with fear and denial. My wife's eyes darted to me once, but she looked away quickly, her lips pressed into a thin line. My daughter stared at the floor, her hands twisting in her lap. The prosecutor approached, her expression calm but determined. "You did well, Mr. Grant. The evidence is clear. The judge will see through their excuses." I nodded, my heart pounding. Every minute felt like an hour. I replayed the testimony in my mind. David's quiet courage, the video of the lock sliding shut, my own words about the hunger, the thirst, the humiliation. I wondered if my wife and daughter felt any regret, or if they were only sorry they'd been caught. The bailiff called us back into the courtroom, and we filed in, the tension thick enough to taste. The judge took her seat, her gaze sweeping the room. "I have reviewed the evidence and the testimony. The facts are not in dispute. The victim was locked in a basement, denied food, water, and access to a bathroom, and left without means of communication. The defense's argument that this was a misunderstanding is not credible in light of the video and witness statements." She turned to my wife and daughter, her voice stern. "This court finds you both guilty of unlawful imprisonment and elder abuse. Sentencing will be scheduled for next month. In the meantime, you are ordered to have no contact with Mr. Grant." The words washed over me, a mix of relief and sorrow. My wife's shoulders slumped, her bravado gone. My daughter began to cry, her tears silent but endless. The prosecutor shook my hand, congratulating me on my courage. David hugged me, his own eyes wet. "You did it, Richard. You got justice." Tom clapped me on the back, pride shining in his face. "You stood up for yourself. You showed them you're not to be underestimated." As we left the courthouse, the cold winter air felt like a baptism, washing away the last traces of fear and humiliation. I thanked David for his bravery, promising to always be there for him. That night, I sat in Tom's living room, staring into the fire, the verdict echoing in my mind. I felt a strange peace settle over me. I had survived the basement, the betrayal, the courtroom. I had reclaimed my dignity, my voice, my life. But I knew the journey wasn't over. There would be sentencing, restitution, and the long, slow work of healing. I was ready. For the first time in a long time, I believed in myself again. I was no longer helpless. I was strong, respected, and free. The days after the verdict were a strange mix of relief and emptiness. I stayed at Tom's house, grateful for his quiet support and the simple routines that kept me grounded. Each morning I woke early, made coffee, and sat by the window, watching the world go on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. My phone buzzed constantly, calls from the detective, the prosecutor, even a local reporter who'd caught wind of the case. I declined every interview, determined to keep my dignity and privacy intact. David visited often, bringing groceries and updates from the outside world. He told me that my wife and daughter had moved in with a distant cousin, their social circle shrinking as word of the trial spread. "People are talking, Richard. Some are shocked, some are angry, but most just can't believe they'd do something like this." I nodded, feeling a pang of sadness for the family I'd lost, but also a sense of vindication. I spent my days gathering documents for the restitution hearing, medical bills from the hospital, receipts for the security system, even the cost of the repairs to the basement door. Tom helped me organize everything, his legal mind sharp and methodical. "You're entitled to every penny, Richard. Don't let them guilt you into settling for less." I took his advice to heart, determined to see this through to the end. The sentencing hearing loomed on the horizon, a date circled in red on my calendar. I rehearsed my statement in my head, determined to speak with clarity and strength. At night I lay awake, haunted by memories of the basement, the hunger, the thirst, the cold, the utter helplessness. But I also remembered the moment David opened the door, the rush of fresh air, the feeling of hope returning. I clung to that memory, letting it fuel my resolve. One evening, as Tom and I sat on the porch, he turned to me, his voice gentle. "What will you do when this is over?" I thought for a long moment, watching the stars appear one by one. "I'll rebuild, Tom. I'll find a new place, start fresh, maybe travel, see the world. I want to live, not just survive." He smiled, raising his glass. "To new beginnings, Richard." I raised mine in return, feeling the weight of the past begin to lift. The legal battle had been brutal, but I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to live on my own terms. The sentencing was coming, and with it the final chapter of this ordeal. I was ready to face it head on, with dignity, evidence, and the quiet strength that had carried me through the darkest days of my life. The day of the sentencing arrived with a cold, steady rain that seemed to wash the city clean. I dressed carefully, choosing a dark suit and a blue tie, my late mother's favorite color, a small reminder of the dignity I wanted to carry into the courtroom. Tom drove me downtown, the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm as we rode in silence. The courthouse was crowded, the air thick with anticipation. I saw my wife and daughter sitting with their attorney, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes fixed on the floor. David was there too, sitting behind me, his presence a quiet reassurance. The judge entered, her expression stern but not unkind. She reviewed the facts of the case, her voice steady as she recounted the evidence. The security footage, the text messages, the testimony from David and the police. She spoke of the cruelty of locking a man in a basement with no food, no phone, no bathroom, and the lasting trauma such an act could inflict. Then she turned to me. "Mr. Grant, do you wish to make a statement before sentencing?" I stood, my hands steady, my voice clear. "Your Honor, I have lost much in the past months, my home, my family, my sense of safety. But I have also gained something, the knowledge that I am stronger than I ever believed. I ask for justice, not vengeance. I want my wife and daughter to understand the pain they caused and to learn that no one deserves to be treated as less than human." The judge nodded, her eyes meeting mine. She turned to my wife and daughter. "You are hereby sentenced to 2 years probation, mandatory counseling, and full restitution for medical expenses and damages. You are to have no contact with Mr. Grant unless approved by the court." My wife began to cry, her shoulders shaking. My daughter stared straight ahead, her face a mask of regret and shame. The courtroom emptied slowly, people whispering as they left. Tom hugged Jed me, his voice thick with emotion. "It's over, Richard. You did it." David shook my hand, his eyes shining with pride. "You're free now. You can start over." As we left the courthouse, the rain had stopped, and a pale sun broke through the clouds. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift from my shoulders. I was free to rebuild, to forgive, to live. That night, I sat in Tom's living room, watching the fire crackle, and thought about the journey I'd taken. I had been wounded, humiliated, and betrayed. But I had never given up. I had fought back with evidence, with dignity, with the quiet strength of a man who refused to be broken. And now, at last, I was ready to begin again. The weeks after the sentencing felt like stepping into a new world. One where every breath was a little easier and every sunrise a little brighter. I moved out of Tom's guest room and into a small apartment on the edge of town, a place with big windows and a view of the river. The first night, I stood in the empty living room, listening to the quiet, and realized I hadn't felt this kind of peace in years. I filled the space with things that mattered: books, photos of my parents, a battered old armchair that had seen me through better days. David visited often, bringing groceries and stories from his own life. He told me he'd filed for divorce, unable to forgive my daughter for her part in what happened. "I can't live with someone who could do that to her own father," he said, his voice heavy with sadness but also relief. We talked late into the night, sharing memories and plans for the future. I started volunteering at a local community center, helping others who had faced abuse and betrayal. It felt good to give back, to use my experience to help others find their own strength. One afternoon, I received a letter from my wife. The handwriting was shaky, the words full of regret. "I'm sorry for what I did. I was angry, lost, and I took it out on you. I hope one day you can forgive me." I read the letter twice, then set it aside. Forgiveness would come, but not yet. I needed time to heal, to rebuild, to remember who I was before the basement, before the betrayal. Julia, my daughter, wrote too. Her letter was shorter, but no less heartfelt. "I was wrong. I let Mum convince me you were the problem. I see now how much you loved us, how much you sacrificed. I hope you can forgive me too." I replied to both, my words careful and honest. "I am learning to forgive, but I need time. I hope you both find peace." The community rallied around me, offering support and encouragement. The local paper ran a story about my ordeal, calling it a testament to the power of evidence and quiet resilience. I clipped the article and pinned it to my fridge, a daily reminder of how far I'd come. As spring turned to summer, I found myself smiling more, laughing more, living more. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor, a mentor, a man who had faced the darkness and come out stronger on the other side. And as I watched the river flow past my window, I knew that my story was far from over. Summer brought a gentle warmth to my new life, and with it a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. I spent my mornings walking along the river, the sunlight glinting off the water, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass. I made friends at the community center, men and women who had survived their own storms and come out the other side. We shared stories, laughter, and sometimes tears. Each of us learning that healing was a journey, not a destination. David became a regular presence in my life, stopping by after work to share a meal or just sit in comfortable silence. He told me about his new apartment, his plans to go back to school, and the relief he felt at finally being free from the toxic web my wife and daughter had spun. One afternoon, as we sat on my balcony watching the boats drift by, David turned to me, his expression serious. "You know, Richard, you saved my life as much as I saved yours. If I hadn't seen what they were capable of, I might have stayed. I might have become like them." I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "We both got a second chance, David. Let's not waste it." That evening, I received a call from the detective who had handled my case. "Mr. Grant, I wanted to let you know that your wife and daughter have started their counseling sessions. The court is monitoring their progress closely. If they complete the program and show genuine remorse, the judge may consider reducing their probation." I thanked him, feeling a mix of relief and uncertainty. I wanted them to heal, to change, but I also needed to protect myself. I spent the next few days organizing my finances, updating my will, and making sure that my affairs were in order. I met with Evelyn, my lawyer, to discuss the restitution payments. "You're entitled to every cent, Richard. Don't let guilt or pity cloud your judgment." I agreed, determined to stand firm. The first restitution check arrived a week later, a tangible reminder of the justice I had fought for. I used the money to make a donation to the community center, helping others who were still trapped in cycles of abuse and betrayal. As the days grew longer and the city buzzed with life, I found myself looking forward to the future. I started taking painting classes, something I'd always wanted to try but never had the courage. I discovered a talent for capturing light and shadow, for turning pain into beauty. My apartment filled with canvases, landscapes, portraits, abstract bursts of color. Each one was a testament to my journey, a silent declaration that I was more than what had been done to me. One evening, as I stood on my balcony watching the sunset, I realized that I was happy, not just content, not just surviving, but truly deeply happy. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, my sense of self, and as the stars appeared in the sky, I knew that the best was yet to come. As the summer deepened, I found myself embracing routines that once felt foreign. Morning jogs along the river, afternoons spent painting in the golden light of my living room, and evenings sharing stories with new friends at the community center. The pain of betrayal had faded into something quieter, a scar that reminded me of my strength rather than my suffering. David and I grew closer, our bond forged in the fire of survival. He brought over fresh vegetables from the farmer's market, and we cooked together, laughing at our culinary disasters and celebrating our small victories. One Saturday, we decided to host a barbecue for the community center group. I spent the morning preparing the patio, stringing up lights and setting out chairs, my heart light with anticipation. The guests arrived in waves, men and women who had faced their own darkness and chosen to step into the light. We shared food, laughter, and stories, each of us finding comfort in the knowledge that we were not alone. As the sun set, David raised a glass to Richard, who taught us that dignity is worth fighting for, and that the quietest revenge is living well. The group cheered, and I felt a surge of gratitude for the life I had rebuilt. Later that night, as I cleaned up the patio, I received a text from Julia. "Dad, I finished my counseling program. The judge reduced my probation. I'm working at a local bookstore now, and I'm trying to make amends. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. I hope one day you can forgive me." I stared at the message, my emotions a tangle of relief, sadness, and hope. I replied, "I'm proud of you for taking responsibility, Julia. Healing takes time, but I believe in you." The next day, I received a letter from my wife. She wrote of her own progress in therapy, her regret for what she had done, and her desire to make things right. "I know I can never undo the pain I caused, but I want to try. I want to be better." I folded the letter and placed it in a box with Julia's message, a small collection of apologies and new beginnings. As the weeks passed, I continued to volunteer, to paint, to live. I realized that my story was no longer about revenge or justice, but about resilience, forgiveness, and the quiet power of starting over. The community center asked me to lead a workshop on evidence-based self-protection and legal rights for seniors. I agreed, eager to share what I had learned. The first session was packed, the room buzzing with questions and gratitude. I spoke of my ordeal, the importance of documentation, and the strength it takes to stand up for oneself. As I looked out at the faces in the crowd, I knew that my journey had come full circle. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor, a mentor, and a man who had reclaimed his life, one day at a time. Autumn arrived with a crispness in the air and a sense of closure I hadn't felt in years. The leaves along the river blazed gold and red, and I found myself walking longer each morning, breathing in the promise of change. My apartment had become a sanctuary, filled with the warmth of new friendships, and the quiet satisfaction of a life rebuilt. David and I continued our weekly dinners, and he often brought news of Julia's progress. "She's doing well, Richard. She's even started volunteering at the community center, helping with the literacy program." I smiled, a genuine pride swelling in my chest. She's finding her way, just like we did. One afternoon, Julia called and asked if she could visit. I agreed, and when she arrived, I saw a different woman, her posture straighter, her eyes clearer, her voice steady. We sat on the balcony, sipping tea as the city bustled below. She handed me a small envelope. "I wrote you a letter, Dad. I wanted to say everything I couldn't say before." I opened it and read her words, each line a confession, an apology, and a promise to do better. She spoke of her guilt, her shame, and her determination to never let anyone control her again. "I know I can't erase what I did, but I want to earn your forgiveness. I want to be the daughter you deserve." I looked at her, my own eyes misty. "You already are, Julia. Forgiveness isn't a gift I give you. It's something we build together, one day at a time." We talked for hours, sharing memories, regrets, and hopes for the future. She told me about her work at the bookstore, the friends she'd made, and the small joys she'd rediscovered. "I'm learning to be happy, Dad, not just for others, but for myself." That evening, after Julia left, I sat in my armchair, the letter in my lap, and felt a peace I hadn't known since before the basement. I realized that my journey had become a beacon for others, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal, that dignity could be reclaimed, and that the quiet power of evidence and boundaries could change lives. The community center asked me to speak at a citywide event on elder rights and legal self-defense. I accepted, determined to use my story to help others find their own strength. As I prepared my speech, I thought about the man I had been. Wounded, underestimated, humiliated, and the man I had become, strong, respected, barebacked, and triumphant. The story was not just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been locked away, silenced, or betrayed, and who had found the courage to fight back. The city's first frost arrived overnight, painting the rooftops silver and turning the river into a ribbon of mist. I woke early, feeling the chill in my bones, but also a quiet excitement. Today was the day of the citywide event at the community center, and I'd been invited to share my story with a room full of strangers, people who, like me, had faced betrayal, isolation, and the long road back to dignity. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy sweater and a jacket that had belonged to my father, a small token of the resilience he'd taught me. David picked me up, his car warm and filled with the scent of fresh coffee. "You ready?" he asked, his eyes bright with encouragement. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, my nerves fluttering, but my resolve strong. The community center was buzzing with activity, volunteers setting up chairs, guests arriving in small groups, the air alive with anticipation. I was introduced by the director, who spoke of my journey from victim to advocate. And then it was my turn. I stepped to the podium, the lights bright on my face, and looked out at the crowd. I began with the truth. They locked me in the basement. No phone, no food, no bathroom. I was helpless. But I was not alone. I found my way out, with evidence, with help, and with the law. I spoke of the importance of documentation, of trusting your instincts, of never letting anyone convince you that you deserve to be mistreated. I described the courtroom, the power of video evidence, the relief of seeing justice done. I talked about forgiveness, not as a gift to those who hurt us, but as a way to free ourselves from the past. The audience listened in rapt silence, some nodding, some wiping away tears. When I finished, the applause was warm and genuine. Afterward, people lined up to thank me, to share their own stories, to ask for advice. One woman, her hands trembling, pressed a note in. To my palm, "You gave me hope. Thank you." David hugged me, pride shining in his eyes. "You changed lives today, Richard." That evening, Julia called to ask how it went. I told her about the applause, the stories, the sense of community. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said. "You turned your pain into something good." I sat by the window, watching the frost glisten in the streetlights, and realized that my story had become a beacon, not just for me, but for everyone who needed to know that survival was possible, that dignity could be reclaimed, and that the quiet, strategic power of evidence and boundaries could change the world. The journey wasn't over, but I was no longer walking it alone. The weeks after the community center event were filled with a new sense of purpose. I was invited to speak at other gatherings, church groups, senior centers, even a local college class on criminal justice. Each time, I told my story with honesty and detail, never shying away from the darkest moments, the hunger, the thirst, the humiliation of being denied a bathroom, the terror of being cut off from the world. I described the legal process, the importance of evidence, and the power of a single ally, David, who refused to look away. After every talk, people approached me with their own stories, some whispered in shame, others spoken with newfound courage. I listened, offered advice, and encouraged them to document everything, to trust themselves, and to seek help. Julia began to join me at some of these events, sharing her own journey of guilt, growth, and forgiveness. Together, we became a team, father and daughter, survivors and advocates, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal. One afternoon, after a particularly moving session at a women's shelter, Julia and I sat in a quiet cafe, sipping tea and watching the world go by. She reached across the table, her eyes shining. "Dad, I want to start a foundation, something that helps people who've been trapped, physically, emotionally, financially. I want to give them the tools to fight back, just like you did." I felt a surge of pride and nodded. "I'll help you every step of the way." We spent the next few weeks planning, meeting with lawyers and social workers, building a network of volunteers. The foundation launched with a small grant and a big dream, and soon we were helping people escape abusive situations, navigate the legal system, and rebuild their lives. The local news ran a story on our work, and donations began to pour in. David joined the board, bringing his own experience and compassion to the team. The of us, once bound by pain, were now united by purpose. As winter deepened, I found myself reflecting on the journey. I thought of the basement, the darkness, the fear. I thought of the courtroom, the evidence, the moment the judge pronounced justice. I thought of the community center, the applause, the hope in the eyes of strangers. And I thought of Julia, her hand in mine, her voice strong and clear as she spoke to a room full of survivors. "You are not alone. You are not powerless. You can fight back, and you can win. That night, as I sat by my window watching the snow fall, I realized that my story had become something bigger than revenge. It was a story of survival, of dignity reclaimed, of the silent strategic power of truth. The scars remained, but they no longer defined me. I was ready for whatever came next. Spring returned with a promise of new beginnings, and as the city thawed, so did the last remnants of pain that had haunted me since the day I was locked in that basement. The foundation Julia and I started was thriving, helping dozens of people find safety, legal support, and the courage to reclaim their lives. Our story had been featured in a national magazine, and I found myself invited to speak at conferences and workshops across the country. Each time I stood before a crowd, I remembered the darkness, the hunger, the humiliation of being denied even the most basic dignity. I spoke of the power of evidence, the importance of allies, and the necessity of boundaries. I told them how David's courage had saved me, how Tom's friendship had anchored me, and how Julia's journey from guilt to advocacy had inspired me to forgive. One afternoon, Julia and I were invited to the state capitol to receive an award for our work. As we stood on the steps, cameras flashing, I felt a wave of gratitude for the second chance I'd been given. After the ceremony, Julia hugged me tightly. "We did it, Dad. We turned our pain into something good." I smiled, my heart full. "You did it, Julia. You showed the world that even the deepest wounds can heal." That evening, we hosted a celebration at the community center. Survivors, volunteers, and friends filled the room with laughter and hope. David gave a toast, his voice steady and proud. To Richard, who taught us that dignity is worth fighting for, and to Julia, who proved that forgiveness is the greatest strength. The applause was thunderous, and I felt tears prick my eyes. As the night wore on, I slipped outside for a moment of quiet. The city lights shimmered on the river, and I thought about the journey, the betrayal, the courtroom, the long road back to myself. I realized that my revenge had never been about punishment. It had been about reclaiming my life, my voice, my peace. I had become a mentor, a friend, a father who had learned to forgive without forgetting. The scars remained, but they were a testament to my survival, not a mark of my defeat. As Julia joined me on the steps, her arm around my shoulder, I knew that our story was not just about what had been done to us, but about what we had chosen to do with it. We had turned pain into purpose, silence into advocacy, and fear into hope. The basement was behind me, the future wide open. And as the first stars appeared in the spring sky, I whispered a silent thank you. To David, to Tom, to Julia, and to the part of myself that had refused to give up. I was no longer helpless. I was whole,